Since as far back as I can remember, I have caught myself imagining the quality of certain rooms when empty. Our old dining room in Tripoli, in the house where we lived until I was 8. My current writing studio in London when I'm not in it. A close friend's place, much frequented galleries and familiar museums. All the lights are switched off and the curtains drawn, yet the furniture and books and pictures all hold their ground, waiting with an intimate patience, patience that stares desolation in the eye. I don't know why I do this, but in Siena, where I felt I had arrived at the edge of things, the high-ceilinged rooms of my flat, rooms older than me, older than entire cities elsewhere, seemed to have been always waiting for me. Their atmosphere, which I detected from the very first moment I entered the place, was of that unobservable emptiness I had sought all these years. I exist mostly to one side of time, only in rare moments, for example, when I am with those I love, or in times of great exuberance, or when I am writing and the work is going well, do I feel in time, that I am where I am meant to be, and utterly free from the wish to be anywhere else. The other times have the interference of discord, as though I were detained and that somewhere nearby, possibly in the next street, there's a desired encounter or event taking place, one from which, whether by coincidence or ignorance or bad luck, I'm being excluded. The strange thing was that I never suffered this in Siena. Every day, and for the entire month I spent there, I felt myself to be in time. I woke up at the right moment and left the flat just at the perfect time, so as to encounter everything that unfurled before me. I never rushed or felt myself hurried by anything. Everything I experienced was happening at the pace at which it ought to happen. And at the end of each day, when I returned to the flat, the long, meandering, unplanned walk I had taken remained vividly etched in my memory. I would look at my map of the city permanently spread on the small table between the two windows and could trace not only the route I had walked, but also all the crisscrossing tangents I had taken off it. It was as though Siena's shape had been imprinted into my mind. All this made me feel I was not so much inside a city, but an idea, an allegory that was lending itself, like an old and well-tailored garment, to my needs. I found something in Siena for which I'm yet to have a description, but for which I have been searching, and it came at a resonant juncture, the time between having completed a book and seeing it made public, but also at that strange meeting point of two contradictory events, the bright achievement of having finished a book and the dark maturation of the likelihood, inescapable now, that I will have to live the rest of my days without ever knowing what happened to my father, how or when he died, or where his remains may be. That was when I found myself in Siena, in the city that starts and ends so decisively. Every day I walked to its edges, north, south, east, west, and it often felt as though I was tracing the limits of myself. Siena was so varied and consistent, so small and inexhaustible, that it seemed during those days to be endless. It was not only an allegory or a state of mind, but the self as city, modest and particular, yet never totally knowable, for it was a constantly moving target, changing with every passing influence and unfolding day. The days moved with me locked inside this simple routine. I would go to the Pinacoteca in the morning, then walk to one of the edges of the city. The fewer people I saw, the more engaging the city and the paintings became. I mostly managed not to speak a word. I felt as though I were, with the passing of each day, coming a step closer to a fire. It warmed and delighted, but I somehow knew was capable of annihilating me. And I suspected, in the silence of those days, that that might be the fire's true desire.
I have the pleasure this evening of welcoming Hisham Matar, author of A Month in Siena, from which that passage is drawn. Hisham is the author of 6 books and countless essays and is the recipient of awards and honors too numerous to cite in full here. But it's worth singling out, however, his extraordinary book of 2016, The Return, that centers on his return to Libya in 2012 to search for answers relating to the disappearance in 1990 of his father, a political dissident of the Gaddafi regime, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, and his most recent highly acclaimed novel, My Friends, published in 2024, ranked as one of the best books of the year on every major list, shortlisted for the Booker Prize, the National Book Award, and I'm pleased to say, just today, nominated as a finalist for the National Book Critics Award. In the passage he just read here, Hisham's narrative voice is clearly unmistakable, layered, often atemporal, and certainly poetic. He weaves experience into a rich and elegant cloth of many textures, sometimes soft and transparent, but at other times enveloping and protective. A Month in Siena is in fact an astonishing book that resonates in this multi-layered way. It's a genre that truly is uncharacterizable. We've had this discussion before. It's neither autobiography, travel diary, nor meditation. Its subject is neither the city, nor its art, nor experience. It somehow separates each while it brings them all together. And Hisham, I'd like to just start by opening this conversation, because it's already so rich from that reading, how you came to the project, how you came to Siena. What was your way into the questions that you explore in this marvelous book?
Well, I just have to say before anything, just how delighted I am to be here. Thank you so much for coming. And it's also a very private, personal delight to be in conversation with Stefan, whom I admire and appreciate very much. And it's also, we were saying before that this is a little bit strange for us because we have been having this conversation for a few years and we're not used to having it in public. So excuse us if we are a little bit rusty in this regard. But for me, well, it's at around the age of 19, I developed a kind of phobia for museums. I found being in a gallery really troubling. And just to give you a sense of the sort of the quality of the trouble, is that it was, I just felt overwhelmed by a sense of inexhaustible demand, right? And I didn't know where to start. There's too many things. Each one needs a lot of attention. I didn't particularly like the air inside a museum and just felt uneasy. So yet I had a real appetite for art. So I thought I have to come up with some kind of scheme. And the scheme I came up with is that I would go there to the National Gallery. Thankfully, I lived close to it in London, and the National Gallery is free to enter. So for a poor student, it meant that I was able to go there every day, and I would go in my lunch break and stand in front of a picture for 20 minutes, and then leave. And every week, I would choose a different picture. It was meant to be a sort of temporary solution to a problem, but now it has become a lifelong, a lifelong habit. I don't, you'll be glad to know, go every day, but I go maybe, once or twice a week. And I stay with the same painting for a while. Anyway, in those days, as a young man, I was interested in not these kind of paintings. I went to see Cezanne and Titian and Velasquez and people like that. And but to get to that gallery, you have to walk through the medieval gallery. And I would walk through hurriedly and intolerant, just want to get through. But these paintings started to work on me, and this picture was really the start. I found it so just inexhaustibly interesting. It's like a miniature essay in what it means to look, to not look, to be suddenly when the blind. So you have two versions here of the blind man, when he's blind and when he's healed, right? And the one that he is healed is looking away. So I always thought that actually makes a lot of sense, because once you can see, you're implicated into a social language of how you should behave. And it reminded me of a childhood friend who was born blind. And I always secretly, of course, I didn't envy his blindness, of course not. But what I envied was a sense of physical ease. He never really worried about how his arms fell, or his clothes never quite fit, and he didn't care. And so this painting became a subject, a location for me to think about what it really means to see, to be seen, and all of that. So it was, that's how it started.
I love that. And it's this is, as you know, a wonderful painting in the National Gallery of London. And we've always experienced it there alone as a independent work. But it's part of the back predella of Duccio's Maestà,
Yes.
which for the first time since the 18th century, as we keep celebrating here, has been brought together in our galleries upstairs. And
it's so exciting to
well,
see.
It's sort of extraordinary to see. But one of the truly revelations of the installation here is to see the adjacent panel, which is the Transfiguration. And what you just said, Hisham, of that backward sort of look, because it's, or glance, but of the person who can't see, sort of mirrored truly in every way, looking out of the picture is made even more resonant when we see it in sequence here, as the person who can see sees a transfigured being, sees this vision, and recognizes that sight is really that, right? It's a kind of understanding as well as a way of recording and seeing. And I love that. And of course, when I shared that with Hisham earlier, he, in his very devious way, threw the question back at me at how I came to this, how we came to this table. And if you have read this marvelous book, you will understand what I'm showing you here. In the distance, well, let me first say that I obviously go to Siena regularly, and it's been a place that I've returned to time and again. And not to give you too much of a portrait of of me. I like staying at the very same hotel, and if I can, I like staying in the same room. And this is the view out that window. And it doesn't look at the city, it looks out at the countryside. It looks out even more wonderfully west towards the sea. And after reading Hisham's book, I realized that one of the most moving parts of the landscape, and I share this image because it's a picture I've texted you often at different times of day. Those cypress trees in the distance, that kind of hilltop city, is actually a walled cemetery. It's actually the cemetery of Siena. And so all its residents from centuries have been buried there. It's a kind of enclosed bank of lives lived in Siena, of the people who made the city. And as a result, it's almost, when you go there, a kind of museum even of, there are the plaques, there are the people. In Italy, there's even often a photo of the deceased. And I never really registered it as a site at all. Of course, I was there to go see paintings. I was there to go to the archives. I was there to understand the city. And it was only after reading, and no offense, but this tiny book, that my eyes were opened to the complexity of the city and of space, and the importance of walls, obviously, to define certain questions, which is, alas, sometimes stifling with the air of a museum, but often contain a place for us to consider bigger pictures. And I love that. And I really can't register enough how that really opened me up to a certain way of even conceiving of how we would shape a narrative of an exhibition. How would we understand these worlds that we were bringing together, meaning these pictures, these lives, these stories that each one of them shares, these experiences that each one engages within the walls of the project, of the exhibition. And this is something that seems so central to your project. I'd love to even just explore that more. And I realized in thinking about that Siena is a city that has looked to itself from the start. And even in the case of Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Good and Bad Government, come up with a new visual language. Alas, this is a fresco in the city's town hall. We couldn't bring it to the show, but Ambrogio comes up with a way of showing visually allegory, how to allegorize the self. And I'd like to just explore that idea with you a bit more.
Yeah. No, it's also, one of the things that I found so unusual about this work, and why I think now retrospectively, why I was so drawn to it at that moment when I was 19, is because it was such a powerful year in my life, because it was the year that I lost my father, and I lost my father in such an obscure way. He disappeared, and there was a lot of silence and secrecy around it. And so it was a state of disappearance and of inarticulacy, And these paintings seemed to me, I didn't think of it then, but in retrospect, perhaps I was drawn to them because they seem to be doing exactly the opposite, that they are appearing very generously and have this, even though they're very complex, they have this attitude to be explicit, to be just immediate in their effect and in their discourse. Even though, of course, when you look at them closely, you find many more layers. But also they're extremely articulate, at the same time. That was maybe the first draw. But then the other thing that I think has constantly surprised me about them and why that month in Siena became so intense and vivid uh, is that they are, strangely, given how old they are and their subject matter, often religious paintings belong to a tradition that I am not native to, and so on. There is something incredibly practical about them. You know, they seem to be engaged in a discourse, and that they are interested in creating a space of wonder and playfulness. You know, that they were experimenting. And with this one here, with the allegory of good and bad government, um, it's doing that in a very explicit way. But I think, you know, there's something that Tayyip Saleh, the Sudanese writer, speaks about what an allegory might be. And he describes it as something attracting the light at the base of, at the bottom of the sea, you know. And it attracts the light and shoots it off in different ways that it doesn't tell of itself. So it might be a ring, it might be a piece of glass, it could be anything else, right? So I'm sympathetic to this way of seeing an allegory as something that is generative of meaning and ideas, but also that its source remains obscure. You know.
Right. I mean, you know, the erudition around Ambrogio's political theory here and his the environment. So the urban environment that he builds, so many of the buildings here are so Sienese. The brick, the arches, you see the different crafts, you see students learning, you see all of this imparted knowledge. And one of the most extraordinary things when, Hisham, you refer to the I like this notion of practicality or just kind of presence or just the logic of it all, is that the scene spreads out across the whole wall. Alas, we can't get a camera wide enough to capture it all. But there's this beautifully zigzagged wall that confines that built space, that logic of a built system. And in fact, though, the expanse of that allegory is equally divided between that world and the world outside and nature itself. And the figures actually leave the city and enter into that extraordinary space.
But you know, I've noticed that you have been quite mischievous. You're the one who's mischievous because you've escaped. You didn't really tell us how you got to these paintings, because you and I got in touch after you read A Month in Siena.
I did.
But by that stage, you had already been thinking about this fabulous show. So how does this start? Because I think one of the things that we, I think, agree on is that these are peculiar. It's not obvious, in other words, why we are interested in it. In fact, it's not really obvious. It's very interesting how successful the show has been and how many people have been going to it.
Thank you.
It's all, so I think, you know, knowing a little bit about how you got to it, and then thinking together about why perhaps we are interested in it and others are interested in it.
That's a wonderful question, and it can be explored in so many dimensions, as you know well. You know, the story of this moment in Italian painting is most often Florence, and nothing gives me greater pleasure than to think of the story that's not being told because of the central narrative. And in the case of the Italian Renaissance, that is Florence, and it's a story that's been shaped since the Renaissance itself by Florentine theorists who are themselves practitioners. So it's an important story to think about. Artists, architects, sculptors, writing their own history. But it was a very patriotic story. It was really the story of these artists placing themselves in a great arc, and in that case, the arc from Giotto to Michelangelo, as we all know. And yet, just, in modern times, 45-minute drive away was this entirely different aesthetic, this entirely different place, this landlocked place, seemingly on a hill. Look around, there isn't a river, there is no sea, there's just no air outside of it. And yet, when you start to study it more closely, you recognize that it's the central point on this wonderful road that goes from northern Europe through its gates, in through the north, out through the Porta Romana to Rome, to its south. And with that came this extraordinary traffic of people, this exchange of ideas with them, but more wonderfully, these objects. And as we've discussed, one of the, let's say, unsettling things about the exhibition is it's anchored by probably one of the smallest paintings in it, the small Duccio in our collection here at the Met, the Stockley Madonna. And it reminded me so often of how many different lives, objects, just very much from their very presence, their present, evoke for so many New Yorkers, so many people who come to our gallery. That is still the trophy acquisition, the painting that the museum reached highest to buy. And everyone
and
sort of...
It's very small.
It's perfect. Yeah. And yet when you look at it...
Some people got that joke.
Yeah. It has those candle burns at the bottom. And you realize that had those flickering lights just been a half an inch closer to it, it would no longer be with us. And it's that kind of fragility of the story, this kind of mirror into two worlds that was really what brought me to the story itself. And this is a conversation, so I don't want to take any more it's really airtime, but I did want to say that, and you know this so well, we met to look at paintings, not to talk about the book after I had read it. And right after that, COVID hit. And so we were in this kind of alternate world. And for me as well, the story ends in 1300 in the galleries, which was a moment of great plague and pestilence. And all of the artists who we look at in this exhibition were dead by then, some actually dying of a pandemic plague, not dissimilar from what we were recognizing all around us. And this dialogue of presence and loss was just so resonant as the project unfolded.
No, I think it was a really wonderful thing putting that Duccio at the entrance, because it acts almost as a magnet, the way it pulls you in very strongly, and it's so concentrated, all the activity in it, and the way that it also thinks of itself as a painting, right? It thinks of itself as
the painting of a painting.
A painting of a painting. But also, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of that, the usefulness, what I meant by the practicality of these paintings, Several of the, what's been interesting in the response to the book is a lot of contemporary artists were excited by the fact that I was writing about these paintings that they feel, from their perspective, many people aren't interested in. So I've discovered that don't want to give you an impression there's a lot of people. I'm talking about 3-4 people, the artists that I'm talking about. But they are
expanded considerably in the last 3 months here in New York. It's a wonderful thing.
The conversations we've had, and it's fascinating to me. And these are very, avant-garde artists who are, many of them have not held a paintbrush in a very long time. Yet these paintings speak to them in a very practical, direct way. They seem to be instructive about a certain way of looking and thinking. And I wonder if it's because, I don't know, I mean, I'd love to know what you think, but I wonder if it's to do with the fact that they were themselves wondering, that they were painted at a moment, in other words, where the the expectation of what a painting might do or could do was suspended. And so they were making it up. And they were not also operating from a perceived center, that they had a sort of authority of, um, of knowledge about what great art was. You're the art historian, so correct me. But
No.
but-
It's so key.
Yeah.
Maybe the word is they were instrumental. They were both useful in one
Yeah.
way, and yet, on the other hand, they were so abstract. Their structures, their systems, their language was so new and so other that they divide that interesting. They bridge that interesting divide in a really extraordinary way. And I think that's one of the experiences of seeing such a concentration of these objects together, right? There are so many people who still try to grapple with the fact that it's unclear which sense one should behold them with. And is it something purely optical, or is it something tactile? Is it something that you should hold, or is it something that you should see? Is it something that when you see from a distance looks like metal and enamel and something very, very, very eternal? And then when you get close, you see it's a fiction of materiality, and yet on the other hand, an absolute celebration of the manipulation of that.
And also that tension exists between the secular and the spiritual in them, or the sense that they are so clearly filled with visual worldly delight, but they're also evocative of things that are beyond that.
Right.
Yeah.
No, right. They somehow represent that.
Yeah.
Right. And present that, which is what's so fascinating.
Yeah.
About it.
Yeah.
And the wonderful time we've had in the exhibition together, I'm constantly reminded of how we keep returning to the image here.
Yes. This is I think is the most extraordinary thing. It's well, for a start, it's a sketch.
An instrument, which is wonderful, right? It's a tool to making something. Sorry.
But also, it's so rare. There are no sketches from that time because
on paper, no.
Yeah. And so what we're seeing is Lorenzetti think and plan, and of course it's so different from the finished fresco, and the differences are striking, aren't they?
They're extraordinary. Yeah. In fact, when they were discovered, so this is a preparatory layer before the very fine plaster of a fresco surface is applied. Yeah. And that layer, always a neutral stucco, allowed artists to, expand their ideas to the scale of the wall. This is a monumental, I love this slide. It's just slightly smaller than that when you go to the exhibition to see it. And so, dimension is such a difficult thing to register always. Think of even as we try to expand things on our phone screen, somehow that isn't satisfying. We keep wanting it bigger, and then no, we want that small miniature locket as well sometime to capture something. And so here the artist is trying to scale. Truly, I don't want to say scale up, because he's just trying to measure the subject. And in this case, with Ambrogio Lorenzetti, one of the things that is so wonderful and that we've been able to think about is this profile of him that the great Florentine sculptor, writer Ghiberti makes of Ambrogio, where Ghiberti, the great early Renaissance 15th century sculptor, writes a treatise on painting and on art. It's called The Commentaries, I Commentarii. And the only painter he singles out by name, not a Florentine, but the Sienese Ambrogio Lorenzetti. And he singles him out because he says that Ambrogio was an intellectual, a philosopher, a thinker, and not a craftsman. He took art or took material and made it into ideas and art. And I love that because you can see that at work here.
Absolutely. And also the fact that, I mean, of course, I'm also very moved by the fact that he could have never expected that anyone will ever see this.
Yeah, but how delighted
Right.
I always say this to anyone I see, to think that he's having his day 700 years later in New York City, sort of peeking at his, ideas like that.
And particularly because, I mean, who knows what happened, but if you look at this and then you look at the final result, you could imagine the argument, right? Because here,
this is just,
he does something that's psychologically much more complex. This is the moment when the news comes, and the news has such a powerful effect. She is fainting almost. She's almost being pulled down by this mission, and she's looking in the opposite direction. She's looking away from where the news is coming. And as you said, I think so poignantly, that the way he sketches her body itself comes to resemble a vessel, as though hearing the news alone impregnates her, right? And all of that complexity he manages to do in this sketch. And I could just imagine a cardinal coming in and saying, no, hold on, slow down there.
Yeah.
So he does something different where she's looking up, she's looking towards Gabriel, and she's receiving the news with great and with awe, but also with a sense of command. So it's such a shift, and it just shows that Lorenzetti was involved in a mental reckoning with this moment. It wasn't just let's draw this thing. It was, and just to have a glimpse of that after all these years is phenomenal.
It is, and the image we've chosen to share this evening, I think underscores something that also resonates so much when we're in the galleries, which is the isolation of just the singular moment. She's alone with this. She has to deal with her emotional reception of this absolutely immeasurable news, right? From where? What? Now what? It's sort of an extraordinary moment that only she can sort of sort through. I mean, we're a kind of strange witness when we're in the galleries to that. And one of the most extraordinary juxtapositions, and for me still to this day, 3 months into the exhibition, I can't quite ever get tired of, is to see Ambrogio's other Annunciation right next to it that has this rational space, this kind of very, very measured world that we then can be very clearly situated in and somehow rationalize. And for me, so wonderfully, and we should have brought that image here, the extraordinary union between word, because he writes the Annunciation on it, and image, which is what your evocative descriptions so often bring off the page for me. And we were also talking, and I very much hope you've had time with the book, and I'll put a plug in right now. If you haven't, we have some signed copies in the Net bookstore on your way out this evening. But one of the extraordinary things of reading Hisham's book is that you come upon these paintings, these wonderful worlds within the text, with no caption, no word to frame them. And it's an extraordinary way of looking at paintings in such a new and fresh way.
Yeah, we wanted to have the text and the images, the paintings occupy the same kind of place or weight. So you encounter the images as part of the text. So quite a lot of fun producing that. And my wonderful publisher was very patient with me in putting it together. And we collaborated in a way that was wonderful. Yeah.
One of the things I envy, and we talked about this, is, you know, as an art historian, I come to images with a lot of layers of academic thought. My language is already something I've learned. It's very hard to have an independent voice because it's unclear whether you're still then doing art history or doing something very other. And love to know how you find the language or how you come to anchor your thoughts in these images, what the relationship is.
That's such a good question, Matt. I think I'm very much, I don't, I mean, I've never analyzed it really carefully for the obvious reasons, but I don't write about a picture because I've figured it out and I'm documenting what I've gleaned from it, you know. So the writing for me is a way of looking, really. It's a way of being with something and thinking through it and with it in some way. And I think that goes back to what has been a sort of sustaining interest and fascination with these paintings, because they are generous in that way. I mean, in both senses of the word. They also generate in you, you know, sort of ideas. And also I have to say that a big part of it is because I am still in some way bewildered, you know. It's not clear to me how are you supposed to look at a picture. It's not obvious to me. In fact, it's not clear to me how you're supposed to read a book either. I mean, of course we know, you read the first sentence, the next one, carry on until you get to the last sentence, hey presto, you've read it. But we also know that when we've read something multiple times or read it under certain conditions, we know that we've accessed something different in it. So, but I think with pictures, it's more deceptive because they're so apparent. You know, who's to say, if you looked at it the national average is 4.5 seconds. So if you look at it for 4.5 seconds, who's to say you haven't seen it? Of course you've seen it. But we also know that that's not all the seeing. So, and part of the writing about it or thinking about it in that way is finding a way to abide by it, you know, to land on it. In fact, a landing place is one of the names of the chapters in the book. You know, it seems to me that we are often, maybe this is why these paintings have spoken to a lot of people, that we are often, aren't we, looking for a place to reside, you know, a place to just pause for a minute and consider things, you know. And paintings like these that are so vibrant and entertaining and complex and are just such active places to land.
I love that notion of landing, and I especially love it because you know, you've offered to return to your book with us and to land back at the Met, which is not to give spoiler alert anything away, but where your pages lead us, and be delighted if you would close here.
I should just say that I'm eternally grateful to my friend and colleague Rachel Eisendrath, because she was the one that introduced me to this picture. And if you haven't read it yet, please go and read her wonderful review in the Yale Review about the show. It's absolutely splendid, a work of art in itself. So this is the end. So the book is really me in arriving in Siena, being in Siena, and I'm doing the thing that you're not supposed to do. I'm reading you the end of it. But it's not that kind of book, don't worry. I had to go to New York for work. The day after I arrived, I met a couple of friends for dinner. She's a human rights lawyer and he's a professor. We met at a place they like. Notwithstanding their optimism, the optimism of successful people, they both, at an unexpected turn in the conversation, began to confess such inconsolable disappointments regarding their lives and careers, veiled sentiments that seemed to conceal powerful criticisms of one another, each listed with the hint of blame and quiet violence that some couples are capable of, all the missed opportunities, the roads not taken, the now uncorrectable regrets. The following morning, I woke up and spent a few minutes searching on my phone for flights back to Siena, wondering how I could possibly escape all my work commitments. I walked to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I wanted to see Paradise by the Sienese painter Giovanni di Paolo, painted around 1445, nearly a century after the Black Death. I found it quickly and without consulting a map or asking an attendant. The painting was much smaller than I had anticipated. I had not cared to read its measurements in the online description. My impression was that it would be as tall as a 10-year-old child. But in fact, it was small enough to wrap in a newspaper. Its surface was rough and cracked. The painting imagines a reunion in the hereafter. According to Di Paolo, such a reunion would take place in twos, with each person facing the other, holding hands. The pairs are arranged in a sort of waltz, in 3 horizontal rows, 6 couples on the top, 4 in the middle, and 4 on the bottom. The picture is organized vertically, as though the earth has become a facade. All values are equally represented, and none diminish into a realistic perspective. Right at the top, there's a glimpse of the horizon, curving innocently, and a row of apple trees fencing the sky. They are heavy with fruit. Now that we have gone full circle, the painting seems to say, the eating of apples is not only permitted, but also encouraged. What is it for the dead to remember the living? I wondered. To still be able to recognize those we knew when the soul was flesh. The saintly are greeted and welcomed by angels. Even the reunion is ecclesiastical. Then there are men and women, like the spouses buried together in the cemetery in Siena, holding hands and looking into each other's eyes. This surely is the way to be, I thought to myself, that one should take hold of those one loves most and simply look into their eyes for a long time, or perhaps for eternity. Other pairs seem to be the same person but at different stages of life, the older self greeting the younger. Only one couple, a nun and a monk at the bottom right-hand corner of the frame, is accompanied by a third person, a younger nun who seems to be restraining the older one. She has her arms wrapped around her as though trying to stop her from greeting the approaching monk. Could it be Eloise and Abélard, the lovers who could love only from a distance? They had preceded Di Paolo by some 3 centuries. I was sure he would have read their letters and known about Abélard's desperate plea against writing, claiming it is a disease. Eloise, on the other hand, was not bothered by transgressions. She instead was interested in appearance and disappearance. We are much fonder of the pictures of those we love when they are at a great distance than when they are near to us, she writes to him. If the portraits of our absent friends are pleasant to us, how much more pleasant are our letters. And she is wonderfully greedy when she asks him, "Let me have a faithful account of all that concerns you." That must surely be the ambition of every reunion, not only to identify and be identified, but also to have an accurate account of all that has come since the last encounter. And it must surely follow that what lies behind our longing and nostalgia is exactly this need to be accounted for. It is as if what De Paulo is thinking here is that a true hell is not the hell of fire, but of not being recognized by those closest to us. We want to be seen by them and, in turn, rediscover our own powers of remembrance, and to finally find the consolation that lies between intention and expression, between the concealed sentiment and its outward shape. The painting understands this. It knows that what we wish for most, even more than paradise, is to be recognized. That regardless of how transformed and transfigured we might be by the passage, something of us might sustain and remain perceptible to those we have spent so long loving. Perhaps the entire history of art is the unfolding of this ambition, that every book, painting, or symphony is an attempt to give a faithful account of all that concerns us. When Diana joined me in New York, we spent several days hardly seeing anyone else. We went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art a couple of times, but on each occasion, I wanted to see what she wanted to see. It was only 2 or 3 weeks later that I spoke to her of Paradise. I took her to see it, and for the next 3 months we spent in the city. We returned to it almost every week. We looked forward to these visits as though we were going to see an old friend. Thank you.
Hisham, thank you for joining us this evening. True pleasure. And Siena, The Rise of Painting, closes on Sunday. Please, if you haven't had an opportunity to see it, come. And again, this wonderful book is available on your way.
Thank you, Stefano. Thank you for this wonderful show. Congratulations. Thank you.